Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into something really heavy, but absolutely crucial. The stark differences we see in suicide rates between men and women.
Hmm.
We've got a range of sources here. Research analyses from places like PMC, articles from, Wikipedia, Samaritans, Very Well Mind, BBC.
Good cross-section.
And our mission really is to try and get beyond just the surface data, to grapple with what's often called the gender paradox in suicide.
Right, the paradox, that's the key thing, isn't it? Because when you first look globally, females actually report suicidal thoughts more often. And attempt suicide more frequently, too. Sometimes, like 2 to 4 times more often than males.
Especially younger women under 25, the sources say.
Exactly. So more ideation, more non-fatal attempts there.
Okay, so that's one side of it. But here's where it gets, frankly, quite disturbing.
Yeah.
Despite attempting less often, men die by suicide at significantly higher rates.
That's the core of the paradox.
Yeah.
Globally, around 2015, the rate for men was about 1.7, maybe 1.8 times higher than for women.
And that's the global average. In the Western world, it's even more pronounced, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Jumps way up, often 3 to 4 times higher for males in many Western nations.
Wow.
And it gets even wider for older men, like over 65. It's a persistent, tragic pattern.
So attempts higher for women, deaths drastically higher for men. What do the sources point to? What's driving this awful gap?
Well, the most consistent factor seems to be the methods used.
Okay.
Females tend to use methods that are less immediately lethal. Think drug overdosing, for example.
Right, which might allow for intervention.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Whereas males more frequently use methods with a much, much higher chance of death. Things like hanging, carbon monoxide poisoning, firearms.
That makes a grim sort of sense. I think I saw a European study that broke this down.
It did. It found hanging was actually the most common method for both men and women, surprisingly. But significantly more common in men. About 54% of male suicides versus around 36% for females.
And the second most common.
For women, it was drug poisoning, about 25%. For men, though, it was firearms, nearly 10%. And firearms, well, they have an incredibly high fatality rate.
So the lethality of the chosen method seems like a huge factor. Some sources mentioned intent, but that seems more debated.
It is debated. Some research suggests differences in the sort of intensity of the suicidal intent, but the evidence seems much stronger and more consistent around the difference in method lethality being the primary driver of the death rate gap.
Okay. Beyond the method itself, what else is going on? What about bigger picture stuff?
Right. You have to look at macroeconomic factors, too. They play a really significant role, especially for men.
How so?
There was a huge study. 175 countries found unemployment hits male suicide rates particularly hard.
Okay. That feels intuitive, sadly. Economic security, identity.
Exactly. A 1% rise in unemployment was linked to a 1% rise in the male suicide rate relative to the female rate globally.
Wow.
And it particularly impacts adults aged 30 to 59. They saw an even higher increase, like 2–3%, when unemployment went up.
So economic downturns are disproportionately lethal for men in this context.
It seems so. On the flip side, higher GDP per capita, so more national wealth, was linked to lower suicide rates, especially in lower income countries.
Interesting. And what about political instability?
That was odd. Things like civil wars were linked to lower reported rates, but researchers think that's almost certainly just underreporting.
Yeah.
Chaos makes data collection difficult.
Yeah, makes sense. So economic stability is almost a public health intervention here. What are the barriers, then, to tackling this?
Big ones. Social stigma is huge, obviously. Suicide is still such a taboo topic.
Hard to get help if you can't talk about it.
Precisely. Then there's poor data quality in many places, underreporting again, especially where it might be illegal, and just fundamentally difficulty accessing mental health services. That's a massive barrier everywhere.
So given all that, what do the sources suggest for prevention? It has to be gender aware, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It needs to be targeted. Some strategies focus on, like, shifting those rigid cultural ideas about masculinity, make it okay for men to talk about feeling vulnerable or needing help.
Yeah, breaking down that stoicism idea.
Exactly. Other approaches are more practical, restricting access to legal means. Think safer firearm storage, barriers on bridges, things like that. And also interventions that challenge that feeling of being a burden some people have by really emphasizing the devastating impact suicide leaves on families and loved ones.
And more research, presumably? Specifically looking at men and women separately.
Critically needed, yes. We need to understand the distinct risk factors better.
There was also a point about media reporting, which I found really interesting.
Yeah, that's important. One source really criticized how the media often focuses on suicidal thoughts and attempts.
Where female numbers are higher.
Right, and they tend to downplay the much higher rate of actual deaths by suicide among males.
Which totally skews public perception of who is most at risk of dying.
It really does. It can create a misleading picture.
So, wrapping this up, we've seen this incredibly complex picture. Gender, method choice, damn economic pressure, societal norms, they all weave together.
Yeah.
But the data is stark. There's a clear, persistent, tragic disparity. Men, particularly in the West, particularly older men, are dying by suicide at far higher rates.
And what really stands out is the urgent need for prevention, for research, for public conversation that actually reflects that reality. We have to look past the attempt numbers, important as they are, and face the devastating reality of the death rates.
It really forces you to think, doesn't it? If specific methods and economic vulnerability are such key drivers for the higher male death rate, are our current prevention efforts hitting those targets hard enough,